Good evening. Welcome to Detroit Public Library's virtual author series. My name is Christine Peel, and I, along with my colleague Tracy Massey, will be your host for the program this evening. This is a webinar format, and so we will be reading questions that you put in from the chat. We ask that you support local businesses, so the book is available from source booksellers. This evening, we are welcoming Rachel Marie Crane Williams. Professor Williams is an associate professor of art and art history and gender, women's, and sexuality studies at the University of Iowa. And she's also the author of the book. Jamon Jordon is an educator, writer, and historian who has been a researcher of African and African American history for more than 20 years. He is the founder and CEO of Black Scroll Network History and Tours in Detroit, where he leads tours and presentations on African and African American history. So again, welcome to the program, and let's get started with the conversation.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you, Detroit Public Library. And thank you, everybody who's attending today. I'm glad to see you. I'm glad that you came to hear us discuss this important book about the 1943 race riot or uprising in the city of Detroit. And I'm happy to be here to talk to Rachel Crane Williams. And we're going to be talking about her book, Run Home. Well, I know it's hard to see when I got this background, but this is it. Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed. Yes. And it is about the 1943 race riot. Now, I want to start with what prompted you to write this book? First, what prompted you to write this book? But then the other thing is to do it in a graphic novel form. And those answers are probably related. You're doing this book in the graphic novel form, or what some people will call comic form. What prompted you to do this?
That is a great question. And I'm so tickled to be here tonight and so excited to talk with you and so honored to be part of this event at the Detroit Public Library. It was just such an amazing place. I would urge everyone to check it out, to check out all the branches. It's beautiful. So that is a great question. So I had just done, I'd spent a couple of years researching the coup that happened in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. And actually there's so many parallels to the recent election and the events of January 6th that sort of line up really well with what happened in Wilmington, North Carolina. And I had done that it began with the work of Norman Etheridge, who was a cartoonist, and he did these horrible racist cartoons that appeared alongside opinion pieces at that time written by Democrats. And of course, the Democratic Party is very different now than it was at that point in time. But I started researching his work, and I'm an artist, I'm not a historian. And I thought, I'd also seen American Splendor, so I'm going to date myself a little bit, and just to let you know how far back my interest goes in this. And I'd done two pieces around the Wilmington coup and massacre. And I had lunch with my friend Joe Parsons, who at the time was the editor at UNC Press, University of North Carolina, or actually, I think that I'm trying to think. Yeah. So he said, if you're really interested in these things, you should look at what happened in Detroit in 1943. And I said, what are you talking about? Because in my mind, World War II, I did not think about racial disturbances, which of course a white woman wouldn't, because at that time, World War II, it's the deep Jim Crow South. There is all kinds of parallels between us going overseas to fight for justice and the injustices that were happening at home. And I would urge anyone, if you haven't read Caste by Isabella Wilkerson, you should definitely read that. There's some incredible insights into sort of the parallels of what was happening in our country during World War II and what happened with Nazi Germany. But so I, looked into this, and what I knew about World War II had come from my family who had served and lived through it. And when I began to read about what happened in Detroit in 1943, I was really blown away. It was one of the largest disturbances. Well, actually, it was in the country in 1943. And it was just a real it's actually just a beautiful case study, sort of about, you know, how when people are oppressed, and how when there is a shortage of schools, real estate, recreational spaces, safety and security, you know, these things can happen. Violence happens, and so, and I'm sorry if you can hear my dog. So, you know, when I started and the other thing that was compelling to me is, and this is what I was saying to Christine earlier, so many people were involved in what happened before 1943 in Detroit and what happened after 1943 in Detroit that became major figures in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And I thought, you know, so many people got their early start organizing in Detroit and had lived through this experience, and it really catalyzed them. So it really was a fascinating story. The other thing is, Detroit is a beautiful, you know, city, and was a beautiful city in the 1940s. It was known as the Arsenal of Democracy. And I was really excited about the story for all kinds of reasons related to history, but also, and this is just sort of where my artist point of view comes in, the 1940s was just an amazing time aesthetically. The cars were amazing, the clothes were amazing, the architecture was amazing. And so I thought, you know, this is a real opportunity to have a little bit of fun in terms of drawing. And at the time, so I'm a qualitative researcher, and then I'm, you know, I also draw. And like I said, I'd seen American Splendor, and I thought I would love to tell this story as a graphic novel. And I started doing work on this in, I think, 2008. That might be the first time I went to Detroit, and it took me a really long time to get it done for all kinds of reasons. I mean, in part, and Jamon, I think you can really speak to this, it's a complex story.
It is.
And you can't just talk about, you know, the uprisings. You have to talk about what happened before.
That's right.
Afterward.
That's right. Yeah. You can't talk about just those 3 days because you're not telling the story if you do that. And so that's a great thing. And I, of course, I enjoy the graphic novel form of telling this story. I previously read the March series for John Lewis, the John Lewis graphic novel series. And so that was my entree. I mean, I grew up reading comic books, so let me start there. But when it came to using a graphic novel or comic form of telling history, my first entry into that was the March series for John Lewis. And that was a powerful series. And when I went to see him, and he talked about this series and talked about how they approached him, how the writers and illustrators approached him about doing this. And I thought, wow, who would ever think of that? So I thought it was great that you did it in this form, because of course that also makes it approachable. It also makes it accessible. So there are people who may never have picked up, and specifically young people, but others who may never have picked up a book about the 1943 race riot in Detroit, but they may step into this because it is a different way of entering this information. And so I thought it was good. Yep.
And that is a great series. Nate Powell is the artist, and he is phenomenal. Yes. He's also just a phenomenal human being. You know, I'm like, John Lewis and Nate Powell together? Are you kidding me? You know, two just amazing people. And what a phenomenal series. I am so glad you mentioned that. There's a lot of great, you know, graphic novels that are based on history. There's a ton of nonfiction. The other one I would say that I would love for people to look at, there's a piece about Emmett Till.
Yes, I've seen it. I haven't read it yet, but I have seen that it exists.
Excellent. And, you know, it does all the things that you can do, which is one of the reasons that art form is so appealing to me. You know, you can tell all these stories without words. So you've got the story written in words, but then there's all these sub stories happening in the images. That's great.
That's great. Now, a very important thing you did, and you just talked about it a little bit, is that you didn't begin on June 20th, 1943, because you didn't just tell the story of those 3 days. You gave a lot of background on segregation and discrimination in the military, You gave a background of the World War II era civil rights movement. You talked about housing discrimination and the union battles when it came to the factories, particularly the former auto factories, which will switch over. They were auto factories, but they switch over to war munitions, becoming the arsenal of democracy. You talk about that. You talk about the labor movement. Tell us, why is that important? Why did you feel it was important to tell this backstory to bring us to June 20th through the 22nd?
I want people to understand, and one of the reasons I don't think of this, I think of what happened those 3 days as more complex than a riot, is because, when people think about riots, they think it just spontaneously happens and then there's no reason behind it.
That's
but
right.
What happened in Detroit was really reasoned. You think about, one, it became a center for immigration. So you had so many people immigrating, white Southerners from the South and Black Southerners from the South, and everyone was looking for the same thing, an opportunity to improve their existence.
That's right.
And they imagined Detroit as this beacon on the hill where, they could get a job, they could live in this wonderful place that wasn't segregated. And, of course it was, but in people's minds, it was not, where children could get a good education. I mean, they had ideas about what Detroit was like. And, part of that had been sort of peppered through the culture through Henry Ford's, $1 a day, and sort of networking to bring people to do work in the automotive industry, which was booming at the time. But what people didn't realize is that they wanted people's labor, but they didn't want their proximity. So there was not housing. So when you think about the Black population of Detroit, which grew exponentially, especially in the late 30s and early 40s, white people, Polish people, white people in Detroit did not want them living close to them.
That's
so
right.
What happened was, all of the folks in Detroit, not all of them, but a lot of the majority of people who were Black ended up living in a very small area. And living in very crowded conditions, really deprived in terms of services in those areas, in terms of spaces where people could recreate, in terms of safety, and also surveillance. The police at the time, there were roughly 3,400 police in Detroit. A tiny, minute number were Black. Tiny. Most of these are white men. So there was a real shortage. And then in terms of jobs, there literally, and again, I'm going to refer to Isabella Wilkerson, there was a caste system in terms of who could work where and what kinds of jobs were available, who could live where, who could, use certain facilities and at certain times. And so, the flip side of that is Paradise Valley and Black Bottom were just rich with culture. Rich with culture, with Black culture. And
That's
so,
right.
There is another side to that. But so you really have this incredible pressure cooker, where people begin competing for resources. And white people were afraid that the pie was not big enough. And we know that's a falsehood. We know just because, I have something, if you get something too, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to get less, or that what I'm going to have is any worse. So I really felt like it was important to tell that story. And you can't talk about Detroit without talking about labor. I have to say, I was really seduced, honestly, by the labor archives at Wayne State University.
Wow, yes, they are awesome. Yes. The Walter P. Reuther Labor Archives, they are necessary for everybody doing research about the city of Detroit.
Yep. And that was really, that, and honestly, the Detroit Public Library were the two places I visited the most to do my archival research. And the archivists and the librarians at Wayne State were phenomenal. They would say, you might be interested in this, and they would bring me this folder. And, as a person who's not a historian, that guidance was just incredible. And I think you and I probably share a passion for the archives, in that it is a feast. You
is.
Folders, and you open them up and you think, I am touching this piece of paper from
That's right.
1937, and this
That's
person
right.
behind it. You can feel the ballpoint.
That's right. You can see exactly where Thurgood Marshall said this thing or wrote this, or
I mean,
yeah,
I have chills thinking
yeah,
about it,
yeah,
you know?
yeah. It's very powerful. It definitely is a very powerful experience.
Incredible. So, when I went to every time I went to the archives, and this is part of the reason it took me so long to write it, another story would show up, So it took me forever to really understand what was happening with labor, and that labor leaders realized we need to have Black people in our union or we are not going to make it, and which is, again, historically something you see over and over again,
That's right.
And so that was a really important story to tell. But, there were a lot of other stories to tell, what was happening in the war, how the automotive factories retooled to begin, manufacturing things for defense, and who got left out of that picture. And so, that was interesting. The other thing that really drew me to the story is, when I read the books that other historians had written, and I mean, I stand on the shoulders of giants. I mean, I just have to say, I could never have done any of this without the previous work of historians. But, a lot of books were written right after it happened. Not a lot, but a fair number right after it happened by white men who were journalists, sociologists. Then after 1967, people returned to 1943 and say,
that's right.
Another set of books, again, mostly written by white scholars. And what they left out in their men, and they left out the stories of women. And, women in the 40s played a huge role, but they were not seen as, their history was not seen as important by people at that point. Black women, certainly.
That's right. That's right.
Important. So, what I found at Wayne State was the NAACP, the work of the NAACP. And in that are all of these phenomenal affidavits, and they tell a really different story of what happened during those 3 days.
That's right.
Feature prominently the voices of Black women.
That's right.
Who in many ways, obviously were victims of police brutality, but also, who witnessed what happened to people in their families who had been caught up in this riot. I mean, there was a lot of folks that, didn't really realize what was going on, got up, went to work, got on the streetcar, and then all of a sudden found themselves in the middle of this terrifying violence. And
that's right. That's right. Because there was no 24-hour CNN in 1943. No one could text message you and tell you, hey, don't come home on the streetcar today. There's a race riot. They're pulling people off the streetcars on Woodward. So you found yourself in it, and many times it was too late to do anything about it.
Yeah. And, these had been contested spaces. I mean, it wasn't as though
that's right.
This was like something that no one had ever imagined. I mean, Sojourner Truth, the housing situation had happened. And you may want to talk about that because you probably know more than I do, but that's an incredible story.
Yes.
The Ossian Suite story is an incredible story, and that's, far earlier, but there had been disturbances on the streetcars. There had been disturbances on Belle Isle, in the amusement parks, in, different areas. But I cannot imagine getting up to go to work in the morning. You get on a streetcar and then you find yourself being pulled through the window by a mob of like 10,000 angry white people who are going to chase you. And then you're sitting there and the police are just watching, aren't going to help you no matter how much blood and how much begging happens. So, the other thing I think people should realize is this violence was incredible, horrendous,
yes, it was.
And terrible. People died, but also that there were people just living their lives in Detroit during those 3 days. So holding those two spaces in your mind, really creates a sense of dissonance.
The other thing that you talk about in the book, or you illustrate in the book, is this coming together, this crashing together of what's going on a national level and what's going on just in the city of Detroit. And so on the national level, there's all these things going on. Of course, there's a war. So that's one major thing. And that's really implicated throughout these 3 days. These 3 days are really connected to this war, that has a lot to do with what's going on. So that's part of it. There is this civil rights fight on the national front. And then, of course, there's these issues right here in the city of Detroit. So I want you to talk a little bit about, because I know there's people here who may not have heard of it before, but you talk about it in the book, Executive Order 8802. Tell us a little bit about that.
And, that order was really about trying to end discrimination, specifically in the defense industries. And, it's hard to imagine. So, for example, the Detroit FEP was really instrumental in, how that was interpreted. And that was really the only group that thought about sex. So if we talk about women, again, gender is at the heart of this. But, what's going on nationally is the politics are really interesting to negotiate. I mean, and you still see this sort of lukewarm, like, we want to do the right thing, but we want to do it really slowly. We don't want to upset good white people by doing these things, and there was a real, like, obviously the Jim Crow South is happening. I mean, there is no doubt that you have Black people who have joined the military, who have tried to help the war effort. And I mean, Black women too, they were nurses, incredible forces. And they come down to the South to train or even to be deployed. And suddenly they realize, I'm going to die for this country that will not serve me a cup of coffee. That will not let me use this bathroom, that will not let me sleep here. And so, our country had this dirty, dark, long stain historically. And so, there was a whole group of activists trying to draw attention to this and saying, this is the moment that we, end Jim Crow, that we end discrimination, that we come together truly as a nation, and that we believe that everyone is equal. And really, we're talking mostly about men at this point, but for the most part, everyone is equal. And we don't even get to even talk about, and I didn't even get to it in the book, what other races besides Black and white people we're dealing with. But, the country is trying to turn people's attention to the war effort and turn their heads away from the internal strife. But it is there, it is all over the country at that point. And so it's a real battle. And you've got these sort of moderate politicians who are really trying to walk a fine line, so there's a part in the book where a group of Black leaders meets with the president and says, you need to integrate the armed forces, totally integrate. He says, I really want to do that, but it's really going to upset people. People won't enlist. The white soldiers are going to get really upset. Maybe they could be musicians, maybe we could start that way. I mean, so these hideous conversations happening. There's all kinds of things. I mean, and there's a long history of this, when you think about blood donation, when you think about serving, the country in the military, even schools at that point. So, nationally, the landscape is really fractured. And, racism is horrendous. And you've got people who become major civil rights leaders, saying this has got to stop. And there's, they are part of a long group of people that have been saying for, hundreds of years, this has to stop. So it's not new. But the war really focuses attention on the racial tensions in our country in a very different way.
And just as you stated, women are at the forefront of all of this, even though when the history happened, women are doing all these things, but when we tell it as if men did it all.
Right.
And so the history is less patriarchal than the way we tell it. Right. And so we have to revisit these stories and find where the women really were, and then retell the story the correct way with the women doing all the things that they were doing. So Sylvia Tucker, right here in the city of Detroit. Sylvia Tucker is a member of Bethel AME Church and a member of the Detroit Housewives League. And she is going to fight against the discrimination of blood, because Red Cross at that time during World War II is not accepting Black blood. So she protests this, writes a letter to Eleanor Roosevelt even. And eventually the Red Cross accepts Black blood, but they segregate it.
Right.
And it won't be until years later, when they'll accept Black blood and stop segregating Black blood. But that fight begins by a Black woman. So again, Black women and in the city of Detroit. So you got this Detroit level thing, you got this national thing, and one part of this Detroit level story, which interfaces with the national story, is the Sojourner Truth homes.
Yep.
So the Sojourner Truth homes, of course, are built and being funded by the federal government.
Right.
Because so many African Americans are coming to the city of Detroit. The federal government needs them to work in these facilities and these factories that are producing war munitions, but there's not enough housing. Houses in Black Bottom are overcrowded. You have way more people living there than ought to be. You have homes built for 1 or 2 families that have 4 and 5 families living in them. The Brewster projects are full, and so many other areas have been keeping African Americans out through racial restrictive covenants and other forms of housing discrimination. And so the federal government is going to build, I mean, this is a modest thing. This isn't like they're about to build a whole neighborhood. It's a little small area, a little piece of a neighborhood. And they're going to build these housing projects, the Sojourner Truth homes. But that creates such a tumult by the 7 Mile Fenelon Association. And so now you got this group that's going to organize to keep African Americans from moving in. And then there's going to be a loss and then a victory and a loss and there's going to be a back and forth. Black people are going to lose their access to these homes and then get it back. But then a mob is going to show up to try to block them from moving in February of 1942. And then once again, in the middle of World War II, you got the federal government having to send troops here. So you got the National Guard first, but then you're going to have an army regiment that's going to have to come to the city of Detroit in the middle of World War II.
Yep.
And so, like you said earlier, you kind of know these is all contested space. You kind of know that something can happen in the city of Detroit because there's been battles at the amusement parks, particularly Easttown Amusement Park, which happens just prior to the 1943 race riot. There's been, of course, battles about homes, about where people can live. That has been an ongoing battle about where people can live. Other places, hotels, restaurants, the YMCAs, all of this is segregated at that time. And so there's these battles that are going on in Detroit, which are going to bring us to the war. And the Sojourner Truth Housing Project, to me, that fight really is just the best precursor of what's going to happen a year later. Once you see what happened in Sojourner Truth, you know it's in Detroit's capacity to have a major racial uprising. And that's what
I'm so glad you brought that up. The Sojourner Truth situation was just, again, an amazing thing to dig into. I mean, so when you think about that, class is also an issue because you
That's
have
right.
middle class Black homeowners in Conant Gardens who say,
that's right.
we do not want poor Blacks to come here because our white Polish neighbors are going to lump us all together and it's going to cause real problems. And then you
Right.
also have in the churches, Angela Dillard is an amazing scholar. And I think
Yes,
if
she
anyone
is.
is interested in the role of the churches in Detroit and the history of Detroit, read her work.
Yes.
But the Sojourner Truth situation, it's so interesting how the churches played a role in that. You've got the white Polish Catholics who are very much against this, who are being, supported by their faith leaders, saying that these people are not like us. And they're going to, it's this idea of contagion. They
right.
are gonna, ruin our neighborhood. They're gonna ruin and frighten our young white girls. And it's fascinating because that triangle, that classic racial violence triangle is present at Sojourner Truth. So you have white Polish housewives and their children picketing. You have white male police saying, oh, we can't stop the picketers because we need to make sure that these women are safe. And then you've got positioned as an enemy is Black people trying to say these are our homes, and these are families that they're saying you can't live here. And so, that triangle is present where you've got white men defending white women against Black people. And that story is part of that story as well. But the Sojourner Truth, and a white woman basically kicked off the racial disturbance that happened there by throwing a rock across the street. So, again, the role of women in that disturbance are very, really played down for the most part. And so, so I'm really glad you brought that up. And, I would encourage people again, and I'm sure you take them on your tour, you can see where that all happened.
That's
You know,
right.
and you can see where real estate, like the 8 Mile Wall, is a fascinating place.
That's right.
It is a monument to redlining, and it is
That's right.
still here. And you can literally see and touch that wall, and there's no way to deny that redlining had a tremendous impact on the geography of Detroit. And Sojourner Truth is just that is a really interesting example. And again, you see politicians, white politicians, you know, licking their fingers and putting them in the wind and saying, oh, yes, we need to do this. Oh, wait a minute,
That's right.
maybe we shouldn't, you know, I'm not sure what's going to happen. And you suddenly see Cadillac Square is filled.
That's right.
You know, the public says this is not okay. And so, and in the mayor, I mean, that was one of the things in my book. Mayor Jeffries kind of is, I'm probably not as fair to him as I should be.
Yeah.
You know,
Mayor Jeffries is, of course, he's the mayor at the time of the Detroit race riot of 1943. He's also the mayor of the time of the Sojourner Truth housing battles. And what again, like you said, he is a politician who's really putting his finger in to see which way can I go with this? You know, which way is the public mood? And he's going with the flow wherever that goes. And of course, many times that's going to go against the African American community. But as you said, faith is a part of this, because for so long in the African American community, the battle over faith and freedom went hand in hand. And so churches like Calvary Baptist Church and Hartford Avenue at that time, Hartford Avenue Baptist Church, they're involved in these struggles even before the 1943 race riot, even before Sojourner Truth, but they really come to the battle. That's how they're part of the reason why the African Americans got the Sojourner Truth homes back.
Yeah.
But what we see in the Sojourner Truth homes, again, and I know I got to get you a question, another question.
I love this.
But
I love
what
this.
we see in the Sojourner Truth homes, which is a precursor to the 1943 race riot, is number one, there is this battle over this public space. So this area, they're basically African Americans are going to be fighting with whites over their access to a space. So that's part of what you're going to see in 1943. The other part is the police involvement, how the police are really clearly on one side of this battle. They're not neutral. They're taking a side. Some of them outright take a side. Some of them subconsciously or unconsciously take a side, and it's against the African American community. Then the other party is African Americans are willing to fight.
Right.
So they're not going to just accept this. They're not going to just accept being mistreated or being attacked. They're going to fight back. And so we're going to see that also in the 1943 race riot, that Black people aren't just getting attacked. They're not just being warred upon in those 3 days. They're fighting as well. And they're giving as much as they can in return of what's happening to them. Of course, they can't compete with armed police officers, which makes all the difference in the casualty rate in the African American community versus the white community, because we know that 34 people are killed, 9 whites and 25 African Americans. But out of those 25 African Americans that are killed, 17 of them are killed by members of the Detroit Police Department.
That's right.
No whites are killed. No whites are killed by members of the Detroit Police Department. That's the difference. But Black people are fighting, and that is an important part of the story. But I want to get back to a question for you.
Sure.
And that question is this issue of rumor. So on May 30th, 1921, a 19-year-old Black messenger entered an elevator at the Drexel Building in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, his name was Dick Rowland. He was on his way to the top floor where the colored bathroom was located. The elevator operator was a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. She was the only other person on the elevator. And on the way up, she screamed. And from that, people deduced that he tried to assault her or that he raped her, which from first floor to third floor, the likelihood of that is just so impossible.
Right.
But this is going to cause, of course, the Tulsa Race Massacre. In Detroit, this rumor or this kind of misunderstanding. Well, that was kind of a misunderstanding / rumor. But in Detroit, it's rumors that are really going to drive the beginning stages of the Detroit race riot, which begins at Belle Isle. Tell us about these rumors and how they played a part in the uprising, the racial uprising in 1943 in Detroit.
Absolutely. So you've got people on Belle Isle, and again, I want to make a plug. Go to Detroit and go to Belle Isle. It is beautiful, and if you love architecture, there's some amazing examples of architecture from when that park was in its heyday. And also the bridge. I don't know. I love Belle Isle, but anyway. So there's all of these people. They've crowded onto Belle Isle. It's hot as Hades that day. I mean, it is exceptionally hot temperatures, and you've got people who have worked really hard all week. So it is a real day. People want to fish. They want to barbecue. They want to picnic. They want to just be. And there's not enough room for all the people that come to that island. And so again, we see a real competition between whose island is it. And you've got a lot of young people, and there's a lot going on with young people. I mean, even today, you go to a high school football game, if you sit, I like to watch what happens under the bleachers as much as I like to watch what happens on the field, but there's all kinds of drama, happening with young people. And so as people begin to exit the island, and there's been some scuffles, which, hot, it's June, people are itchy, there's a war going on, there's a lot of people who are just poor, and who just don't have, they're stressed, they're dealing with the stressors of just economic disaster for many people. And so there are these fights that break out. And then on the bridge, there's a giant fight between people trying to leave the island. And you've got white naval people, you've got black people trying to leave the island, you've got young kids, and I say that I'm showing my age. You have adolescents, like older adolescents, people that are probably the ages of 15 to their early 20s, who are eager to live in the world and experience, life on the edge. And so, they're involved in a lot of different things. And so what happens is there's a big fight. There's like over 500 people. And the question that comes up is, how did this start? That's where the rumors begin. So one rumor is that white men threw a black woman and her baby off the bridge. And that led me down a whole I wrote this other book as a result of that rumor about Mary Turner and the lynching of Mary Turner. And, I would tell you to take a look at that one. But that really came from doing the work on Detroit and especially Walter White's influence. So that's one rumor that happened. So, of course, people in the Black community are furious. You have killed a mother and her baby. Another rumor that comes into the white community, and again, I talked about that balanced triangle, is that the girlfriend of a white soldier was raped by black men. So again, that ignites a whole, and we know there's a long history of white men coming together, enticed by that rumor to carry out the spectacle of violence. So that rumor happens, right? And so those two rumors circulate in the community. And in the Black community, there's a huge nightclub called the Forest Club, and someone comes and gets on the stage, says I think they say they're a police officer, there's cars waiting, there's a big riot, come and help. And so when you talk about Black people seizing agency and saying, we are not going to stand for this, we are going to do something about this, we're not just going to be passive, people come together and they're like, we have got to do something. So that happens. And then you've also, and by this hour, it is late. People have been drinking, they have been partying, they are itching to do something. And then you've also got, that rumor circulates in the white neighborhoods as well. So then you have mobs of white people, mostly men, but women were there too. I mean, that's the other thing. Black women and white women were involved in this violence, just like all the other folks. So, they come together. And so you see, basically a war breakout, up and down in the Black neighborhoods, and then also up and down Hastings and Woodward Avenue, and this just escalates and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And the police, I'm so glad you brought up police brutality. were, just as guilty of all of the behaviors that they were sort of sworn to stop. I mean, they beat people, they shot people, they looted. There is a horrible story about the Berner apartments where basically the police opened fire on the apartments. People inside, I mean, these are families, are living in there. A lot of older people are terrified. They're marched out of the building, stood against the wall, patted down, felt up. The apartments are looted by the police. And these people stand in the heat and stand against their building, terrified at gunpoint while all this is happening. So, I mean, the police violence is just a huge part of that story. And again, it's sort of interesting what happens after, all of this happens. And again, you see the parallels with January 6th. You see the parallels with George Floyd. Let's create this interracial commission to come together and figure out who we need to point the finger at.
That's right.
And after all of this happens, of course, they point the finger at young Black men.
That's right.
And they say they're Southern. That's and that's not true.
That's right. It's not true. What they're choosing young Black men and basically saying they're hoodlums.
Right.
So this mayor's interracial committee is created by Jeffries. The governor has created an interracial committee too. They've already blamed the Black community, young hoodlums, and saying they're from the South, which means they are already violent from down South. They're already uncouth. They're already uncivilized.
Yes.
And they're kind of like outside agitators. They're not really from here. So that's the other thing. They're not like our Negroes in Detroit. They're from somewhere else. They're from Mississippi. So the state does it first, the governor's committee, and then the mayor's committee does it next. And then this, of course, is going to fuel the energy behind the destruction of Black Bottom. This is going to give energy to that idea of getting rid of Black Bottom, because there is the Black community that started it. And there's these young Black ruffians, these young Black hoodlums. And what we find is that the African Americans who were involved in these 3 days were older than the whites who were involved.
That's right.
And in most cases, they were in their own neighborhoods or close to their neighborhoods, which lends credence that most of them, not all of them, but many of them were defending their neighborhoods.
Right.
And they were much more likely to be defending their neighborhoods, while whites traveled much further from their homes to get involved in this uprising. So they weren't at home. They weren't in front of their own homes fighting. They were on Woodward. They were at Grand Circus Park. They were at Cadillac Square. They were in the Brush Park neighborhood. They were in Black Bottom and Paradise Valley in some cases. So they were going out, looking more likely to be going out. African Americans did it too. So Black people are going out on Hastings Street and attacking whites who are driving by and walking by. But in most cases, African Americans are more likely to be close to their homes, which lends credence that many of them are defending their communities, and whites are more likely to be traveling far away from their homes to get involved in this fight.
Or they're just caught up in it. They're just, walking down the street and suddenly they're caught up in this horrible violence. So you're absolutely right. I mean, white people seized this moment to take out their anger, their aggression, their jealousy, their fears on the Black community, and really this idea of we are going to basically, teach you a lesson. We're going to suppress you. If you begin to, claw your way up, to get employment, to become stable in terms of the economy, we're going to make sure to destabilize you again and, keep you in your place. And so that is what you saw, these large white mobs that infiltrated these Black neighborhoods and did this work. Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up.
So just as we saw these rumors and in some cases lies and this how it sparks this violence, the rumor that comes to the Black community when Leo Tipton comes to the Forest Club, Sonny Wilson's club. Sonny Wilson's club sat on Forest and Hastings Street. It was the largest club that comes out of the Paradise Valley, period. It has a bowling alley, a roller rink, a dance room, and a 107-foot long bar. And so it is filled with people, and it's hot. So this is all of this is playing a part in how this is going to play out. So Paradise Valley plays a vital role. The existence of a place like the Forest Club plays a vital role in what's going to be happening in those days. And again, as you stated, the white community also, there's a rumor that goes out for them, which always reminds me of the Emmett Till story of what happens there when Emmett Till is accused of flirting, saying baby, and whistling at this white woman at this store. And at J.W. Milam's store, Carol Bryant is the woman, and she's married to Roy Bryant, and J.W. Milam is the brother-in-law. And she accuses him of that. And of course, decades later, she has said that he never did these things. I told my husband that, but he never really did those things. So I made that up, but his life was lost. Okay, all kinds of things happened as a result of the murder of Emmett Till. It changed history over a rumor, a lie, a made up story, and the level of violence that was inflicted upon this 14-year-old child. We see it, what we see in the 1943 race riot is what can happen to a whole city when a story takes legs like that. What can happen throughout a whole city, not just one person, but this really changed the city of Detroit.
Well, and that story, I mean, I hope people will look at Carlos Hill's book. And then also my friend Tim Tyson wrote an amazing piece on that where he talked Carol Bryant. But, what Mamie Till did is flipped the script. I mean, she basically said, you lynched my son, and I get to create a spectacle around this, not you. And I'm going to scare you this time. And so, that's an amazing story, but it's exactly right. I mean, you do have, and again, the target, young Black men, and that young Black men as a target, continues. I mean, you think about 1994 and super predators, I mean, the thing about this story is these threads are just present all the way through, and that's why people say, why should I read this? I'm like, because if you want to know that what is happening right now is not new, it has been going on in this country, and I'm beating the table, just emphasizing this because I feel so strongly about this. If people understood the deep history of race in our country, they would recognize that this is a game that politicians and policymakers and white people have been playing for a really long time at the expense of Black people and Black lives.
Now, right now, there are a number of historians and writers who are working on the Detroit 1943 race riot. Tom Klug just released, he recently cleared up a story behind Moses Kiska. The killing of Moses Kiska, his name wasn't really Kiska, and he finds it in the records who he really was and more about his family. However, I have always thought, and I still do, that the NAACP's investigation of the 1943 uprising, race riot, is really the definitive story on those 3 days. Tell us how the NAACP's account helped you.
I mean, so, I'm a huge fan of the NAACP, and I'm a huge fan as a historian of the NAACP. But when you talk about let's get the record right, the NAACP has done that multiple times, and so for the Detroit situation, they came to Detroit and they spoke firsthand to people who had experienced this violence. They got multiple witnesses for a whole variety of incidents. And so you get this amazing picture that is seen from, 10, 15 eyes. All of these people are using a different lens. There's women, there's men, they're different ages, they have different ideas about what they want to do. Some are longtime Detroiters, some are not. So, I mean, in terms of eyewitness accounts, and, people wrote, that was the other thing that was just fascinating. And again, the archives is phenomenal. You have long handwritten letters, where they said, would you write down what happened? And you see, people doing these beautiful, long narratives about what they experienced, how it felt, what they saw, and who was harmed. And I agree with you. I honestly think, out of all the research I got to read, I think the NAACP's archive is probably one of the most helpful. The other one, and again, I have to put in a plug for the Detroit Public Library, were the letters that were in the Mayor Jeffries collection. I got to read all of those letters, and they also offer this fascinating view of how different people in Detroit were thinking about these things, responding to these things, asking for help. Even before 1943, saying something has to change. We have to do things differently. You have got to do something. But I agree with you. I think the NAACP, as a historian, is probably just one of the richest sources. I mean, it was for me. And, especially even with the book I did about Mary Turner, Walter White's research, and that's an amazing story. And I can just veer just a little bit.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Walter White was, a huge figure and shows up again and again in the 1943 Detroit story. But so in 1918, when Mary Turner was lynched, he had just graduated from college, and he graduated from a college in Atlanta in 1916. One of his first assignments was, for the NAACP, was to go down and investigate these lynchings in South Georgia. And most people probably know this. Walter White appeared past for a white man.
Yeah, he looked at to be white, which is why he was so able to do these investigations.
Absolutely. And so when he went down to Georgia, he pretended to be a traveling salesman, an extroverted traveling salesman, and basically got white people to say, this is what happened. And hundreds of white people saw these things happen, and a huge number of white men in that town, well-heeled white men, participated. And so he finally found someone that said, I'll tell you who was there. I'll tell you what happened, details. He recorded all of this. And the NAACP then takes that evidence and says, you must do something. The same thing happened in Detroit. I mean, I have a huge file folder of all of the correspondence going back and forth, of all of the affidavits they collected. Same with the Sojourner Truth. They were trying to figure out what's going on. So I absolutely agree with you. That is an incredible archive. And you can access it any number of ways. It's easily accessible at this point. It's been digitized. You can read all of them, and it makes for incredible reading. You cannot put it down.
Yeah. Walter White also came to investigate the Ocean Suite case. So, and of course, the NAACP will be behind Dr. Sweet's legal team. But before they do that, Walter White is sent here, and he does an investigation again. His ability to blend in with the white community helps the NAACP investigate on a level that it would be impossible for just any Black person to try to do that same kind of investigation.
Yep. Will you talk a little bit about that? I had a chapter in my book dedicated to Dr. Sweet's story, and then I ended up having to cut it because I was like, it's so far, it was 1925.
Yeah, it's 20 years prior. So
it's
of course,
a great story.
It is. So Dr. Ocean Sweet, of course, grew up in Florida, went to Wilberforce University or college, then went over to Howard University Medical School, then went to Europe, in Vienna to study further, and came to the city of Detroit as a doctor. And because of housing discrimination at that time, African Americans were being blocked from buying homes in certain neighborhoods, mainly through racial restrictive covenants, which were attached to the deed or written inside of the deed itself. But Dr. Sweet buys a home at 2905 Garland on the corner of Garland and Charlevoix on the far east side of the city of Detroit, in violation of this racial restrictive covenant, which is in the deed. But he pays extra for the home. So he pays more than what the home is worth, more than what the asking price is for the home, so that the homeowner will be willing to sell it to an African American, even though it has a racial restrictive covenant on it. So he gets the home. Once he gets the home, of course, there's a mob the white community has been organizing to keep African Americans out of that neighborhood. But this had been going on throughout the 1920s in various neighborhoods in the city of Detroit. And there have been a couple of times when African Americans had to defend themselves against mobs. They had to defend themselves. They had to arm themselves to defend themselves. So even in the 1920s, we've gotten to a point where African Americans are willing to defend themselves, and that might mean arming themselves. So Dr. Sweet is going to follow that route. He's going to have arms for him and his two brothers who are there, Henry Sweet, his younger brother, and his other brother, Otis Sweet, who's also a doctor. His wife is there, Gladys Mitchell Sweet, she's there. His chauffeur is there. His handyman is there, and three of their friends are there. And there's arms for everyone. And when the mob surrounds the house, I mean, it's like a carnival atmosphere. Very similar to how lynchings look down south. That's is right. It looks like outside of Dr. Sweet's home. And he's seen lynchings before. He's seen race riots before. So he sees what he's already has seen before. That's going through his mind at that time. And there's surrounded house. People are coming in cars, in taxi cabs. They're coming. The house is surrounded. The whole street is filled with people. And of course, they begin attacking the home with bricks and rocks. And two shots come from inside of the house at the top dormer window, the middle dormer window. Two people outside are shot, one of whom is shot in the leg and the other is killed. The police who are outside during all of this melee come into the house and arrest everyone in the house. They're charged by the Wayne County prosecutor, Robert Toms. He charges them with first-degree murder. And they hire a defense attorney. They have attorneys already, but the NAACP, the Detroit branch of the NAACP, which at that time, the president is Robert Bradby, who's also the pastor at Second Baptist Church. So we've talked about that before. And they meet at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, which is Gladys Mitchell Sweet's church. It's Gladys Sweet's church where the NAACP meets. That's how they know them. And the NAACP, the national NAACP, sends Walter White in to investigate. And the national branch, the national NAACP takes the legal case. They hire Clarence Darrow to lead the legal team. He's the top attorney of that day. And he's going to argue not against housing discrimination, but he's going to argue in favor of castle doctrine. Your home is your castle. You have the right to defend it. The first trial is a mistrial. It's a hung jury. The judge also is Frank Murphy. And Frank Murphy is a progressive Democrat. Mm-hmm. So we're entering the era where there's some Democrats who aren't segregationists. The Southern Democrats are still segregationists, but some Northern Democrats are moving away from that. And Frank Murphy is a progressive Democrat. And so he's not all these objections that the prosecutor are giving to these arguments. He's not honoring all those motions and statements by the prosecutor because he believes that Black people ought to be treated equal. So that plays a role in the trial as well. The second trial is an acquittal of Henry Sweet. He's tried alone. It's an acquittal. It basically, the argument that Clarence Darrow is that this is a Black family. Well, he doesn't argue it's a Black family. He said, this is a family in this home and a mob is attacking them. If this were any other family, this wouldn't even be a trial. And so everybody knows what he's saying. He's saying if a white family their home was being attacked by a mob and they defended it, no, there would be no trial. The only reason you're trying these people is because they're Black and the person that got killed is white. And he's acquitted. Now, of course, even though the charges are dropped on the family and Henry Sweet is acquitted, this will cause a really ripple effect in that family. That whole family will be broken up over this. Mrs. Sweet would die of tuberculosis, which she contracted at the Wayne County jail. She'll give it to her 2-year-old daughter who will die also. Henry Sweet would die of tuberculosis as well. Dr. Sweet will be attacked by the IRS and the insurance companies, and he'll be reduced to doing odd jobs to make ends meet. He was a medical doctor. He's going to be reduced to that, and we're going to lose Dr. Sweet himself to suicide years later. He's going to get married again, and those marriages are going to fail as well. And it's just on one end, it's a victory, but on the other end, it's a supreme sacrifice. Yeah. And so that's a part of that story. And we're still living with the legacy of that by the time we get to 1943.
Yeah, I mean, that story in and of itself, I would love for someone to write a graphic novel about that because it is just incredible. Absolutely. And again, you can pull the threads all the way till now. If you think about your, house stand your ground laws or,
right.
castle doctrine laws, like all of that. And then also the Second Amendment and Blacks with guns and Black Power. I mean,
Right.
there are so many threads to pull there for that story. Thank you so much for telling that story. That is just an incredible story.
I see Christine is here, so I know she's probably here to tell us that the time is about up. So I'm going to ask maybe one last question. I had a few more, but I want to ask one major question so to end. And so last year, cities exploded in protest over police brutality, the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. What about 1943? Did you do in the book and you want us to leave with that helps us understand our present day issues of racism, police brutality, and other forms of inequality? What from the book do you want to leave us with to really address what happens right now and has been going on for years?
Well, I mean, I think, there's so many messages there that I really feel strongly about. And I do think, the history of policing and the history of police brutality, this should be a major chapter, in that long and ongoing history. But again, I really feel like, the other thing about Detroit that is heartbreaking in 1943 is this horrible violence happens. People lose their lives. People who were not even, had done nothing wrong.
That's right. That's right.
Lose their lives. They are innocent people and they lose their lives. I mean, a large number of people. And then there's hundreds and hundreds of people who are injured. It has a huge economic impact on the city. Obviously, you talked about how later on, those neighborhoods are raised.
Mm-hmm.
It really, the swath of just violence and tragedy that is a result of this is incredible. But again, nothing changes. That's the thing that I really want people to recognize. And so by the time 1967 rolls around, many of these tensions are still present, and so what I want to see is change, real change happen. And I don't want these horrible things that have happened in our time to, again, to have history just close behind them and be forgotten. And for people to say, we're going to write our reports, we're going to grandstand, but we're not actually going to change policy. And those policies are really at the heart of these things. I mean, I think policing, that in and of itself, there's a lot that needs to happen around practices of policing and, mental health. And when you've got people who are in desperate situations, just the stressors of living in sort of touch and go economic circumstances, really can create horrendous conditions for people. So, I think what I want people to come out of this with knowing is that, we are still fighting some of the exact same battles that have been fought for many, many years. And people have got to come to and organize and demand real change.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel Crane Williams. Thank you, Detroit Public Library. Christine, I don't know if you want to, I don't know if we're fielding questions or comments.
I didn't see any questions, but people can ask questions in the chat. There was some commentary. People like your background, Jamon. So can you tell people what that background is?
So behind me is Hastings Street. So that was Hastings Street during, before the destruction to build the freeway, before the destruction of Paradise Valley. So this is a picture of Hastings Street when Paradise Valley was still in existence.
Okay. And just a reminder that the author of the book that Professor Williams mentioned is Angela Dillard's Faith in the City, Preaching Radical Social Change in Detroit. And you can get that at Source Booksellers. And I'm sure there's a copy floating around the Detroit Public Library.
Yes, I'm sure.
I know, at least I know I bought it in 2009, but I was at a different branch then, so I can't speak if it's still there, but there's probably a copy somewhere in Detroit Public Library.
She's an amazing scholar.
Let's see, any other questions? I think everybody, I'm glad too that you mentioned Dr. Sweet, because a couple of weeks ago, someone the same age as me, we were talking about Tulsa, and I mentioned Dr. Sweet. They were like, "What's that?"
Mhm.
and they're the same age as I. And I'm like, how do you know? But so I just directed them to a book about it, and
Good.
because they didn't know, and they grew up in Detroit. Arc of Justice.
Good.
Yes, that's the
Oh,
title
Yeah,
of the
Arc
book.
of Justice. Yep.
fantastic book. That's a fantastic book. And
Very,
again,
very.
Carlos
Yep.
Hill has written a lot on the Tulsa massacre, and I would encourage anyone who's interested. He's in Oklahoma to read his work.
Awesome.
Okay, so I don't see any questions, so we're going to, unless you have something, any other things that you guys want to discuss, we're going to go
Well,
ahead and end it here. Oh, well, wait a minute, Jamon wants to say something.
yep. I do want to say one last thing is that in that even though you stated earlier you're not a historian, well, your work shows that you can step into the waters of history. So that was one thing we learned is that you were able to present this history really in a very creative way. And one thing that I really thought was for me, I mean, I know everybody has their different things they like, but one thing that was really great for me is how you talked about your presentation of Henry Ford. So you showed that, you know, many people don't know that Henry Ford worked with a number of churches to recruit Black workers. People don't know that, especially Second Baptist, Bethel AME, and St. Matthew's Episcopal Church.
Yep.
And you deal with this in the book, as well as Ford's complicated relationship and ideas about the Black community. That they're not, it's hard to just say Ford was just this way about Black people. There are people who consider him a hero because he hired so many African Americans and paid them $5 a day. There are other people who consider him just such a racist, and because of his views about Black people being segregated in the plants and where they could live and what kind of jobs they could have at the plants. So both of these are true. He is hiring African Americans and paying them $5 a day, which is much more money than most factories are paying in the city of Detroit, and way more money than most factories would pay Black people in the city of Detroit. But at the same end, he is a supporter of segregation and a supporter of Black people having these particular jobs at the plant, the most dangerous, the most dirty, and the most difficult jobs at the plant. So on one end, he's creating this Black working and middle class. He's helping to create that. But on the other end, he does believe that Black people are inferior to whites, and they ought to be segregated, and they ought to be helped because they're not able to do it all on their own. So all of that, his relationship with the Black community is complex. And just in a couple of panels, because this is art, you're able to show that. You're able to show that without, I mean, you could do a whole book on just that, but you were able to show it in a few panels that there is not just one way that the African-American community views Henry Ford. And Henry Ford doesn't just have one way of how he views the African-American community. So I thought that was really a very powerful part of the book. And I know everybody will probably have their own things that they come away with, but that was very powerful for me.
Well, and I would say this book by Beth Tompkins Bates is incredible.
Yes,
Black
Beth Bates'
Detroit
book is great.
Henry Ford. Unbelievable book. And of course, beautiful art on the cover, which you can also see in Detroit.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, and you know, actually Ford draws on ideas that were around, you know, when slavery began, this idea of dominion, which is based in, you know, the Bible and Christian teachings about, you know, Ham. And so this idea of, you know, white people are supposed to be at the top of that food chain. It is their responsibility to take care of everything else, you know, as a resource in a way. And so Henry Ford draws on those same ideas, and he is a complicated person. I mean, that's one of the things I regret about this book and about comics in some ways. You know, everyone in this book is complicated. I mean, again, I probably, like I said, was a little unfair to Mayor Jeffries because, again, he's also a complicated figure.
That's right.
You know, Julian Witherspoon is a complicated figure.
That's right. That's right.
And so, so I appreciate you pointing that out. And I, you know, again, you could write for days on Henry Ford and Bennett. I mean, it's a fascinating thing. I really want to encourage people to come to Detroit. I want them to go to the library, the Detroit Public Library, beautiful place. I also have to give my hats off to the Detroit Free Press. the images that were shot by photographers in the Detroit Free Press during the 1943 disturbances were crucial to my work.
Mhm.
I've never.
Yeah, yes, I saw your redrawings of many of them,
Yes.
particularly the African American who was in police custody, but the police were allowing him to be attacked, and he runs away. I've seen that picture, those sets of slides many times, but it really came out in your art that, you know, the way you tell it, and in your art that was really good to restate that story.
Yeah, but I really want people to go to Detroit. I think it's
Yeah.
an incredible mecca, like I was telling.
And come on a tour with Black Scroll Network History and Tours.
How
Join
do
one of my
people
tours
do
when
it?
you come to
Jamon,
Detroit. That's right.
tell people how to book a tour with you.
Yes, so you can book a tour. We will be starting our in-person walking tours in July. July 15th will be the restart of our in-person walking tours. Of course, we've been doing virtual tours for a year. We'll still do those, so you can still do those as well, but we will now add back our walking in-person tours on July 15th. You can go to blackscrollnetwork.weebly, WEEBLY.com, blackscrollnetwork.weebly.com, or you can go to our Facebook page, Black Scroll Network History and Tours, or you can go to our Instagram page, Jamon Black Scroll. So any of those places is where you can go to set up a tour or join a tour that is a public tour. And as you can see, Source Booksellers has this book. So Source Booksellers right here in the city of Detroit, they have the book, and they would be a perfect place for you to go and purchase the book. And of course, the Detroit Public Library would be a good place to check out the book. So if you're going to check it out, go to Detroit Public Library. If you're going to purchase the book, please go to Source Booksellers. Source Booksellers has been a great support for Black Scroll Network History and Tours. So we've done partner programs with them a number of times. So they are great support. And I always like to see them doing anything surrounding Detroit's history and the books that are associated with that history.
The other plug I would say again, if you like graphic novels, the Detroit Public Library has one of the most beautiful collection of graphic novels and a great place to sit and read them. So I would say check that out too. And I know that Source also has amazing graphic novels and comics. So, you know, it takes everybody to make the world go round. And so I'm really pleased to be part of the group.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
thank you.
It has been an honor.
So in the middle of July, people will be able to browse again in Detroit Public Library. So that's coming soon. So thank you again. And thank everyone for coming. And remember to go to Source to purchase a copy or come to us to check one out. There might be a waiting list for our copy, but that's another story. but we do have it on digitally too. So it's on overdrive. So anywho, thank you everyone. I'm glad you enjoyed the program. I know I did. And I will see you all again. I'll see, we'll be having more programs as time goes on. So thank you and have a good evening.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Let's see. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, this was so phenomenal. And I'm serious, when I get to Detroit, I'm going to take y'all out to lunch.
You really should consider doing a book on ASEAN Suite, because a lot of kids, I'm talking about grown people, don't know about it. A lot of children don't know about it at all.
It's a great story. It's a great story. I would love to see a movie. And you know who he looked like? He actually looks like Eddie Murphy. I'm not kidding. Swear to goodness. So I think, I'd love to see someone do a book about that, because it's an incredible story. Incredible. So yeah, I'm glad he told it, because he's amazing. Oh my God.
Oh yeah, he is.
So
but thanks again,
so
Rachel. And if you're looking for, I probably have a place for those books if you're still looking to send them this way.
I will send, I'm just going to box them all up and just send them to you, and just do whatever you need, give them away, whatever is great. I'd be thrilled.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.